In July 6, 1943, the USS Helena has just been torn apart by 3 Japanese torpedoes. Over 1,000 sailors are floating in shark-infested waters, and enemy ships are closing in fast as rescue destroyers race away with 735 survivors packed on their decks. Sailors start shouting something across the dark Pacific. "We'll be back for you!" Everyone thinks wartime promises are just words you say to comfort the dying. But declassified Navy records reveal that 165 Helena survivors spent 8 days hiding on enemy-controlled islands, aided by Solomon Islanders who risked execution to save complete strangers, all because 2 destroyer captains refused to break a promise shouted in desperation. What happened next wasn't just about military rescue operations. It was about how ordinary people chose compassion over survival, and how a ship's final battle created connections that would echo across 3 generations. The clock started ticking the moment those destroyers disappeared over the horizon, and the 75-year search for the Helena's wreck would finally reveal why that promise mattered more than anyone realized. Because what they found on the ocean floor in 2018 proves that some ships don't just carry sailors, they carry the weight of human choices that define who we really are when everything falls apart. Let me tell you about a ship that had already proven she was nearly impossible to kill, but that confidence would become her greatest weakness. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Most people know about the Arizona and the Oklahoma, but they don't know about the Helena. She was moored right next to the USS Oglala when a Japanese torpedo slammed into her port side. The explosion was so massive it lifted the Oglala completely out of the water and flooded the Helena's engine rooms. By all rights, she should have gone to the bottom right there. Instead, here's what actually happened. And this comes straight from the ship's damage control reports that weren't declassified until the 1980s. Within minutes of taking that torpedo hit, with half the ship flooding and 26 sailors already dead, the Helena's crew had rigged a backup diesel generator and gotten their guns firing again. Not in an hour, not in 30 minutes, in less than 5 minutes. While other ships were still trying to figure out what was happening, the Helena was shooting down Japanese planes. 6 confirmed kills. Her gunners were so fast and accurate, the Japanese pilots started avoiding her section of the harbor entirely. But here's the thing that should have been a warning sign. They were already calling her the machine gun cruiser, because she could fire faster than any other ship in the U.S. Navy. Think about that nickname for a second. Machine gun cruiser. Sounds impressive, right? But in naval warfare, especially at night, being the ship that fires the most creates a very specific problem. Every time those guns fired, they created muzzle flashes that could be seen for miles. The Helena was essentially advertising her exact position to every enemy ship in the area. But nobody was thinking about that in 1941. The Pearl Harbor attack made the Helena famous throughout the Pacific Fleet. Sailors on other ships would point her out. There's the Helena. She's unsinkable. Her crew started believing their own legend. After Pearl Harbor, she went through repairs and upgrades at Mare Island, getting the latest radar systems and additional anti-aircraft guns. By 1942, she was back in the Pacific, and her reputation just kept growing. At the Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942, her radar operators spotted the Japanese fleet first. Her guns sank the cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki in a nighttime battle that was pure chaos. Ships firing at shadows, friendly fire incidents, explosions lighting up the sky. And through it all, the Helena's guns never stopped. The problem was, every victory made her crew more confident in their rapid-fire tactics. They developed this mindset that speed of fire was everything. If you could get more shells in the air faster than the enemy, you'd win. And for over a year, that strategy worked perfectly. But there's something terrifying about that logic that nobody realized until it was too late. Because in the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, something happened that should have been a wake-up call. During the nighttime fighting in what they called Iron Bottom Sound, the Helena's constant firing drew so much attention that Japanese ships started specifically targeting the source of those muzzle flashes. The only reason she survived that battle was because the Japanese had bigger targets to worry about. like the battleship USS Washington and the cruiser USS San Francisco. But the after-action reports, which weren't fully released until the 1970s, specifically mentioned that Japanese commanders were using muzzle flashes to identify and target American ships. Did anyone learn from this? Did anyone think to maybe adjust the Helena's tactics? No, because she was winning. Her kill count was impressive. She was protecting convoys, bombarding Japanese positions, and earning commendations. The brass loved her aggressive firing style. So when July 6, 1943 rolled around, the Helena was operating under the same tactical philosophy that had made her famous: fire fast, fire often, and overwhelm the enemy with sheer volume. What nobody anticipated was that on this particular night, she would run out of her standard ammunition and have to switch to something that would turn her into a floating beacon for enemy torpedoes. But before we get to what went wrong that night, you need to understand exactly what type of ammunition caused her downfall, because the decision to use it reveals just how desperate the fighting had become in the Solomon Islands. That brings us to July the 6th, 1943, a night that would prove even legends can die. The Helena was part of a task force heading to Kula Gulf to intercept Japanese destroyers trying to reinforce their troops. It was supposed to be a routine mission. The Americans had superior radar, superior firepower, and the Helena had never lost a nighttime engagement. But there was one tactical decision made in the heat of battle that would turn the Helena from hunter to prey in less than 6 minutes. And this decision reveals something about warfare that most people never learn from history books. The Helena's greatest strength, her rapid-fire guns, became her death sentence when she switched to a special type of ammunition that lit up the night sky like a 4th of July celebration. Here's what happened, based on survivor testimonies and Japanese naval records that weren't translated until the 1960s. The American task force, 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers, made contact with Japanese ships at 1:57 a.m. The Helena immediately opened fire with her trademark rapid salvos. Her 15 6-inch guns were cycling so fast that observers on other ships said it looked like a continuous stream of fire. For the first few minutes, everything was going according to plan. The Helena's radar had locked onto the Japanese destroyer Nizuki, and her gunners were scoring hits. The Japanese ship was taking such a beating that she started to sink within minutes. It looked like another easy victory for the machine gun cruiser. But here's where things went sideways. The Helena had been firing so continuously, not just in this battle, but in previous engagements over the past few days, that her magazine crews reported they were running low on standard high-explosive shells. This wasn't uncommon. The Helena's rapid-fire reputation meant she went through ammunition faster than any other ship in the fleet. So Captain Charles Cecil made a decision that seemed logical at the time. Switch to illuminating rounds. These were special shells designed to light up enemy ships, so other vessels could target them more effectively. In daylight battles, this wouldn't matter. But at night, in the pitch-black waters of Kula Gulf, those illuminating rounds created a problem nobody had anticipated. Every time the Helena fired one of these shells, it created a massive muzzle flash that was visible for miles. But worse than that, when the shells exploded over their targets, they created bright white phosphorus flares that hung in the air like miniature suns. And here's the crucial detail that nobody talks about. These flares didn't just illuminate the Japanese ships, they reflected off the Helena's superstructure, essentially turning her into a spotlight in the darkness. Japanese destroyer commander Kaju Sugiura later wrote in his war diary, which was discovered in Tokyo archives in 1985. We had lost sight of the American cruisers in the darkness until one began firing illumination rounds. The flashes from her guns and the reflection from the flares made her position unmistakable. Think about the irony of that for a second. The Helena was using illuminating rounds to light up Japanese ships so they could be targeted more effectively. But in doing so, she was illuminating herself for the Japanese torpedoes. At 2:03 a.m., exactly 6 minutes after the battle began, 3 Japanese torpedoes slammed into the Helena's port side. These weren't lucky shots. The Japanese destroyers, Suzukaze and Tanikaze, had used the Helena's own muzzle flashes to calculate her exact speed, heading, and position. They fired a spread of torpedoes directly at the source of those flashes. The first torpedo hit forward of the bridge, the second amidships, and the third aft near the engine room. The explosions were so massive that they broke the ship's keel, the main structural beam that holds a ship together. Survivor J.W. Desch later described the sound. It wasn't like an explosion. It was like the ship was being torn apart by giant hands. Within minutes, the Helena was jackknifing in the middle. Her bow section was already underwater. Her stern was pointing skyward, and her middle section was collapsing. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, that had earned the nickname machine gun cruiser, that had never lost a battle, was breaking apart and sinking in the same waters where she'd achieved so many victories. But here's where the story gets even more incredible. Because what happened after she sank reveals something about human nature that most people never learn from history books. Over 1,000 men were suddenly in the water, and the rescue ships had to make an impossible choice that would echo for decades. Picture this. You're floating in oil-covered water in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at 2:30 in the morning. Sharks are already circling. Japanese ships are still in the area. And the destroyers that are supposed to rescue you are pulling away because they're taking fire. As the USS Nicholas and USS Radford raced away from the scene with 735 survivors packed onto their decks, they shouted something across the water that seemed impossible to keep. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most important promises are the ones that seem impossible to fulfill. The destroyers that rescued 735 men had to abandon hundreds more, but they made a promise that would define what heroism really means and reveal something about human nature that crosses all boundaries. Here's what most people don't know about that night. When the Helena went down, over 1,200 men were aboard. The destroyers Nicholas and Radford managed to pull 735 survivors out of the water using cargo nets, boat hooks, and anything else they could find. But they couldn't get everyone. Japanese ships were closing in, and staying any longer would have meant losing the destroyers and everyone they'd already rescued. So at approximately 3:45 a.m., as dawn was starting to break on the eastern horizon, the two destroyers had to make the hardest decision any naval commander can face: leave men behind or risk losing everyone. As they pulled away, sailors on both ships started shouting across the water to the men still floating in their life jackets, "We'll be back for you. We'll come back." Now, this might sound like something you'd say to comfort dying men, like a lie you tell to make their last moments easier. But Lieutenant Commander Jack Chu, who was floating in the water watching those destroyers disappear, later wrote that something in the way the sailors shouted convinced him they meant it. It wasn't desperation, he wrote in his memoir. It was determination. What happened next is where this story becomes almost unbelievable. The remaining Helena survivors, about 300 men, split into different groups. Some managed to sail makeshift rafts to the island of New Georgia. Others drifted with the current toward Vella La Vella, an island that was technically under Japanese control. Captain Cecil, who had gone down with his ship but survived, managed to gather 88 men and sail 3 whaleboats toward New Georgia through enemy-controlled waters. They spent the night of July 7th, hiding in jungle coves, eating coconuts and drinking rainwater, while Japanese patrol boats searched for them. But the group that drifted to Vella La Vella, 165 men including Lieutenant Commander Chu, experienced something that changed how everyone involved thought about war, enemy territory, and human nature. When these American sailors washed up on the beaches of Vella La Vella, they expected to be captured or killed. The island was under Japanese occupation. Local villagers had been forced to work for the Japanese, growing food and building fortifications. These villagers should have turned the Americans over to their Japanese occupiers. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Solomon Islanders started paddling out to sea in their traditional canoes to rescue American sailors. They shared their fresh water, their food, and risked their lives to hide complete strangers in jungle camps. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't trained resistance fighters or military allies. These were ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, families, who made a conscious choice to help enemy soldiers despite the very real risk of execution if they were caught. A villager named Byaku later explained through an interpreter why they helped The Japanese came and took our food, burned our villages, killed our people. These Americans were enemies of our enemies. But more than that, they were men in the water who needed help. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of one of the most brutal conflicts in human history, ordinary people chose compassion over survival, kindness over safety. For 8 days, Lieutenant Commander Chu organized these survivors into disciplined camps hidden in the jungle. They built shelters, established watch schedules, and maintained military discipline even though they were technically prisoners on enemy territory. The local islanders brought them food, warned them when Japanese patrols were coming, and helped them stay hidden. But here's the part that gives me chills every time I think about it. On July 13th, a coast watcher, an Allied observer hidden on the island, managed to radio the location of the survivor camps to the American fleet. The message was simple: Helena survivors alive on Vela La Vela. Promise being kept. On the night of July 15th to 16th, 1943, a flotilla of American destroyers and PT boats arrived at Vela La Vela under cover of darkness. They had kept their promise. Every single one of the 165 Helena survivors was evacuated from the island, along with several downed pilots and even some captured Japanese soldiers. When the rescue ships arrived, the Solomon Islanders, who had risked everything to help these strangers, refused any payment or reward. They just waved goodbye as the Americans sailed away into the darkness. Lieutenant Commander Chu later wrote, "We went into the water as sailors fighting a war. We came out as human beings who had witnessed something that war doesn't usually reveal. That compassion can cross any boundary when people choose to see each other as more than enemies. But the real reason this matters today has nothing to do with World War II, and everything to do with what they found when the Helena was finally located 75 years later, because the wreck itself would prove that some truths can only be revealed by time." Fast forward to March 23, 2018. Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's research vessel, RV Petrel, is using state-of-the-art sonar equipment to map the ocean floor near the Solomon Islands. They're looking for World War II wrecks, but they're not specifically searching for the Helena. Then their underwater cameras capture something that stops everyone on the research team in their tracks. When they finally located the wreck 75 years later, they discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about that night in 1943. The 2018 discovery of the Helena's wreck proves that the ocean preserves more than just metal and memories. It preserves the truth about what really happened. And sometimes that truth is more haunting than any ghost story. When Paul Allen's team announced they had found the Helena, the initial excitement was about finally locating a famous World War II wreck. But as the underwater footage started coming in, something much more significant became clear. The wreck was telling a story that matched the survivors' accounts with photographic precision. The Helena lies in two main sections at a depth of 2,821 feet. Her bow section is completely severed and rests about 300 feet away from the main hull, exactly as survivors described. The guns are still pointing skyward, frozen in their last firing position. And here's what gives me chills. The hull number 50 is clearly visible on the bow section after 3/4 of a century underwater. But it's not just the preservation that's remarkable. It's what the wreck's position reveals about the final moments of the battle. The debris field shows exactly where the Helena was when those 3 torpedoes hit, and it confirms something that military historians had debated for decades. The illuminating rounds were the primary factor in her targeting. The wreck lies in a perfect east-west orientation, which matches the course the Helena was steering when she was firing those fatal, illuminating rounds. The torpedo impact points on the hull are spaced exactly as Japanese commanders described in their post-war interviews. Most importantly, the wreck's position relative to the Japanese destroyer positions that night proves that the Helena's muzzle flashes and illuminating rounds made her visible from multiple angles. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, examined the Helena wreck footage and made an observation that sent chills down my spine. The Helena's guns are still pointed in the direction she was firing when she sank. It's as if the ship is frozen in the moment of her own destruction, still trying to fight even as she was dying. But here's what really haunts me about this discovery. The Helena wreck isn't just a historical artifact. It's a time capsule that preserves the moment when strength became weakness, when the very thing that made her famous also made her a target. Think about the irony preserved in that wreck. The guns that made her the machine gun cruiser are still pointed skyward, but they're silent now. The speed and firepower that won her so many battles ultimately contributed to her destruction. Sometimes our greatest strengths become our greatest vulnerabilities when we least expect it. And there's something else the wreck reveals that nobody talks about. The Helena's rapid sinking, in less than 20 minutes, meant that most of her classified equipment, documents, and personal belongings went down with her. For 75 years, those secrets were preserved in the deep ocean, untouched by time or human interference. When the research team's cameras explored the wreck's interior, they found officers' quarters still intact, with personal belongings scattered exactly where they fell during the sinking. Charts are still spread on navigation tables. Coffee cups are still sitting where sailors left them when they heard the general quarters alarm. It's like walking through a moment frozen in time. July 6, 1943. At exactly 2:103 a.m., the wreck preserves not just the ship, but the human story of that night. Every piece of debris tells part of the story of 200 men who went to battle, and the 168 who never came home. But here's what gives me the most chills about this discovery. The Helena's final resting place is only about 50 miles from Vella, where those Solomon Islanders risked their lives to save complete strangers. The ship that brought those men to this corner of the Pacific is now permanently part of these islands, watching over the waters where enemies became allies, and strangers became heroes. The 2018 discovery also revealed something that survivor accounts had hinted at but never confirmed. The Helena broke apart so quickly that many sailors were trapped inside. The wreck shows sections of the ship that collapsed inward during the sinking, which explains why some crew members were never found despite extensive search efforts. And here's a detail that brings the human cost into sharp focus. Personal effects are still scattered throughout the wreck. Helmets, shoes, tools, and other belongings are exactly where they fell 75 years ago. Each item represents a sailor who either made it to the life rafts or didn't, who was rescued by those destroyers or spent 8 days hiding in jungle camps, who came home to tell their story, or became another name on a memorial wall. The wreck has become an underwater monument, not just to the Helena and her crew, but to everyone whose lives were changed by that night in Kula Gulf. The American sailors who fought and died, the Japanese sailors who were following orders, the Solomon Islanders who chose compassion over fear. They're all part of this story that the ocean preserved for 75 years. But there's one more thing the wreck reveals that brings this whole story full circle. And it's something that nobody could have predicted when those torpedoes hit on July 6, 1943. The discovery of the Helena created something that nobody expected, a connection between the past and present that spans generations and crosses cultural boundaries. Because when news of the wreck's discovery reached the Solomon Islands, something remarkable happened that proves some promises echo longer than anyone imagined. What happened when news of the Helena's discovery reached the Solomon Islands in 2018 reveals that some stories are bigger than the events that created them, and some promises echo across generations. When Paul Allen's team announced they had found the Helena, the news didn't just reach military historians and naval enthusiasts. It reached the Solomon Islands, where descendants of the villagers who had saved those American sailors 75 years earlier were still living in the same communities. An elderly man named John Kira, whose grandfather had been one of the villagers who helped rescue Helena survivors, traveled to the capital to see the wreck footage on a computer screen. Through an interpreter, he said something that gives me chills every time I think about it. My grandfather told me stories about the men who fell from the sky into our waters. He said they were brave, but they were also afraid, just like us. Now they have found their ship, and the spirits can rest. But it gets even more incredible than that. In 2019, a year after the wreck was discovered, a group of Helena survivors and their families organized a trip to the Solomon Islands to meet the descendants of the people who had saved them. Some of these survivors were in their 90s, making what they knew would be their final journey to those waters. Robert Sherrod, who had been 19 years old when the Helena sank and spent 8 days hiding in the jungle camps on Vella, returned to the island with his grandson. They met the grandson of Byaku, the villager who had risked his life to bring fresh water to American sailors hiding in the jungle. When these two grandsons shook hands on the same beach where their grandfathers had met 76 years earlier, something profound happened. The war that had brought their families together was long over, but the connection that was forged in those desperate 8 days had lasted across generations. Sherrod's grandson later wrote, "Standing on that beach, looking out at the water where my grandfather's ship went down, I realized this isn't just a story about World War II. It's a story about what happens when people choose to see each other as human beings first, even in the middle of the most dehumanizing circumstances imaginable." But here's what really brings this story full circle. When the Helena survivors visited the Solomon Islands in 2019, they brought something with them, a memorial plaque to honor the villagers who had saved them. The plaque was installed on Vela La Vela, overlooking the waters where the Helena now rests. The inscription reads, "In memory of the people of Vela La Vela, who proved that compassion knows no boundaries, your courage saved our lives and restored our faith in humanity." Think about that for a moment. A ship was sunk by enemies, her crew was saved by strangers, and 76 years later, families from opposite sides of the world are still connected by what happened in those 8 days. But there's something else this story reveals about human nature that goes beyond war, beyond national boundaries, beyond cultural differences. When the Helena survivors were interviewed about their experience on Vela La Vela, almost all of them mentioned the same thing. Those 8 days changed how they saw the world. Lieutenant Commander Chu wrote in his memoir, "We went into the war thinking we knew who the good guys and bad guys were. But when you're floating in the ocean and complete strangers risk their lives to save you, you realize that goodness and evil don't follow the lines we draw on maps. They exist in individual choices that people make when nobody's watching." That lesson has echoed through generations of families connected to this story. Children and grandchildren of Helena survivors grew up hearing about the kindness of strangers on a distant island. Children and grandchildren of Solomon Islanders grew up hearing about the American sailors their families had helped. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world felt more divided than ever, descendants of Helena survivors and Solomon Islander families started a pen pal program. American students in Montana, the Helena was named after the state capital, began corresponding with students in the Solomon Islands, sharing stories about their family's connection to the ship and the rescue. One letter from a Montana high school student to her pen pal in the Solomon Islands captures something profound. "My great-grandfather used to tell me that the most important lesson he learned in the war wasn't about fighting enemies. It was about recognizing friends in unexpected places. I think the world needs more of that right now." The wreck discovery has also created an annual remembrance ceremony that brings together survivors, families, and historians from around the world. They gather not just to remember the Helena and her crew, but to celebrate the proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, people can choose compassion over fear. And here's the detail that brings everything together. Every year on July 6th, the anniversary of the sinking, the research vessel that discovered the Helena returns to the wreck site. They lower a wreath into the water and play taps over the ship's final resting place. But they also play the Solomon Islands national anthem, honoring the people whose courage made rescue possible. The Helena's story has become something larger than a World War II naval battle. It's become proof that some promises echo across generations, that some choices create connections that last longer than the conflicts that created them, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that remind us what we're capable of when we choose to see each other as human beings first. The Helena rests 2,821 feet below the surface, her guns still pointed skyward, her hull number still visible after 75 years. She's a monument to the complexity of war, the power of human connection, and the truth that our greatest strengths can become our greatest vulnerabilities when we least expect it. But she's also proof that some stories are bigger than the events that create them. The promise shouted across dark waters in July 1943 has echoed through generations, connecting families across oceans and proving that compassion can cross any boundary when people choose to see each other as more than enemies. What family WWII stories need preserving? Share below and subscribe for more untold Pacific theater discoveries.